and welcome to Silver Threads, where we are still walking, still waking, and I'm Carla.
And I'm Eleanor, and this is the show where we trace our present path through the people and stories of the past, as we ourselves, long-term radicals, learn about each other, from each other, and continue to walk, continue to wake. This week, we are joined by Eriel Deranger, a Dënesųłiné mother from the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation and the executive director and co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action, an Indigenous-led climate justice organization in so-called Canada. Deranger is a member of the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change and sits on various boards, including Bioneers, It Takes Roots Leadership Council, Climate Justice Resiliency Fund, Council of Advisors, the UK Tar Sands Network, and WWF Canada, and was a founding member of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus. Deranger's work focuses on Indigenous rights and building intersectional dialogue between Indigenous rights, climate justice, and other social justice movements. She's recognized for her role as a spokesperson for her community in the International Indigenous Tar Sands campaign and developing the Tar Sands Healing Walk. This included developing one of the first Indigenous rights-based divest movements, lobbying government officials in Canada, the US, the UK, and the EU, supporting and leading mass mobilizations against the fossil fuel industry and climate change, and bringing international recognition to issues in her territory with celebrities and politicians alike. Deranger has written for The Guardian, Yellowhead Institute, The National Observer, Red Pepper Magazine, has been featured in documentary films, including Elemental, and is regularly interviewed for national and international media outlets, including Democracy Now!, Aboriginal People's Television Network, and CBC. Welcome to the show, Eriel.
Thanks. Every time I hear my bio, I'm just like, ugh, that's so weird. So weird to hear all the things about yourself. I had to have someone help me write that because I hate resumes. I hate bios. But thank you for inviting me.
It's a beautiful bio. So
yeah, it really outlines this long commitment to the work, which leads to our first question. We ask our guests to share with our listeners a bit of how you got involved in organizing and in the work, maybe some watershed moments. Feel free to go back to really early on. This is the inspiring stories that we like to highlight.
Well, thank you. As per tradition and what I've been told, I'm going to introduce myself in my native language. So, Eklanete, Dënesòłiné, Eriel Tchekwie Hushe, Deranger Betsini Hesli, and Masi Cho. So thank you for having me on your show. So how did I get started? That's a very, very big question that I often make jokes about because I say I come by it honestly, or I was born into the movement because I was. And but that is just not to say that all my siblings chose the same life, I guess. My siblings are regular people doing regular things. Obviously, they're very knowledgeable about the injustices that exist in this country. But for myself, my parents were both political activists. They met via the American Indian movement in the US. And my mom always has this story. She's like, yeah, things were getting kind of crazy because they were both at Wounded Knee in 1973? And they, things got pretty hairy down there, and there was lots of, infiltration and lots of lateral violence started happening, as well as conspiracy theories and all the things that they do to try to dismantle really strong movements like the American Indian movement, Black Panthers, Weather Underground. Historically, any really robust revolutionary organization gets dismantled by the institutions at hand. So my dad, being a Dene man from Northern Canada, just said to my mom, why don't you just come up to Canada with me and we can go live on my trap lands and trap line and just live out there and live on the land. My mom, being this, radical 20-something-year-old, was just like, yeah, probably like, yeah, that's so groovy. Let's do it. I don't know. Right. And so they came up to northern Saskatchewan, where my family's trapline was, still within the Treaty 8 territory that my family's from. And met up with some of my dad's family and built a series of cabins within our traditional territory. That same territory was being explored and slated for development for uranium mining. And, through some shady deals, which is the status quo of the, extractive industry, they somehow managed to get a signature on a piece of paper that gave them the rights to my family's trapline. And the rights to remove our family from the territory. Not like my parents have been living there for quite some time. I think about 4 or 5 years at this point. My sister was born and my mom was 8 months pregnant with me, and my family was forcibly removed by armed security from the cabins that we lived in. And so my family fled, for all intents and purposes, refugees in our own country, to Regina, Saskatchewan, where my mom had some friends and allies. And my mom at the time had a degree in sociology, social work. So she helped to create a place called the Native Girl Center, which was for young women, or young girls or women that were aging out of the foster care system, to help them become established. And so, we the occupation of my mom, of our trap line by my parents, was a political act. And when they were forced off of that, they continued this down the line. My dad is a storyteller and an artist. And my whole life was just protests and rallies and occupations. My mom has family in South Dakota, from Pine Ridge and Oglala. So I spent a lot of time in occupations at the Black Hills with FBI watching us from the hilltops. And this was my life. And my big joke is that, growing up for me, arts and crafts was coming up with protest chants and helping to make placard signs. And as an adult, that served me really well because I'm really good at coming up with slogans. And I've been once coined a sketch master because I'm really good at being able to spatially recognize a piece of paper or a big banner and write out the words that need to go on it. So those skills have served me really, really well growing up. So I've come by it honestly. As an adult though, as a child, my parents instilled volunteering and participating in helping community. So I was volunteering of my own volition by the time I was 11 years old with an organization called Chili for Children in a soup kitchen. I sat on every possible youth council and group you could think of that had an Indigenous focus, at the time being called Aboriginal youth councils or groups. I remember sitting on this one in the 90s, and it was called Act 2000. And the goal was to eliminate racism by the year 2000. It's just oh man, lofty goals. Yeah. And this is just really what I have done as long as I can remember. And I really do feel and through that, it's not I've just had this, oh, I'm just going to be this radical activist my whole life. It's scary, my family, I watched my dad get beaten up by the police and thrown into jail. Our house was being staked out by police and probably CSIS. There was a time where my parents and my mom feared for our family and our family's lives. This isn't just some fun game we're playing. And our existence has been a part of resistance, and being able to actively and very proudly say that you're an Indigenous person in this country, particularly in the 80s and in the early 90s, when you think of the Oka crisis, these are times where it was difficult. And to be instilled and to say I'm an Indigenous person and I am proud to be Indigenous, that was a real act of resistance. That was trying to undo the hundreds of years of colonization that literally tried to kill the Indian in the child, save the man, kill the Indian. These are these things that I was taught at a very young age, and that being proud of who we are was one of the most political acts we could do.
The existence as resistance, that's something that's incredibly powerful, and something that we've also heard from Indigenous folks that have been part of this podcast in the past as well. And kind of with that, like I'm interested particularly, because the word radicalism can be a heavy word, but I'm curious, particularly with like how you kind of were basically born into it, born into this movement and born into a form of resistance just by being who you are. I'm curious, what does radicalism mean to you? And not just kind of in the abstract, but also like specifically with your land, and that land being Indigenous land that has continuously been under colonial control for hundreds of years.
Well, it's really interesting when we try to define these things, because I once read this quote. It was like, I can tell you that whoever discovered water wasn't a fish. And that's because a fish lives in the water, right? And so when you live in radicalism, quote unquote, it's hard to like understand what that is. And then when someone tries to define something that you are intrinsically a part of, it becomes like weird to like conceptualize like a life that you have intrinsically always been a part of. But like thinking about the fact that we do live in this world where we are constantly trying to name and conceptualize for other people's digestion these spaces or movements or people or places. I think with radicalism and like the radical this world, it's really just trying to uncouple ourselves from the corrupt systems that are trying to disconnect the interconnections that we have, whether those interconnections are with the living world or with like each other, or across like sectors. Like it's a radical act to like, as a climate justice organization, let's say like my organization, to do a campaign on like missing and murdered Indigenous women. And people are just like, why are you even talking about that? Like, what's the connection? Like we have like radicalism within radicalism, because it's like, well, no, because like you need to stick to your lane. It's like, well, actually, we're more holistic than we want to think. And being radical is like trying to like push back against the systems that are constantly trying to put us in these boxes. To define what radicalism is like being against that and just being like, what? In life, I don't know, like recognizing the fact that we don't belong in these boxes, I think is a radical act. And so when we talk about like what it means to be radical, it is really just about questioning the systems that we are led to believe are beneficial for us, and almost like taking our blinders off and seeing the world for what it is, and then really experiencing those things, and then trying to make meaningful connections that further to uncouple other people. It's like unplugging others from the matrix, it's like we're going to unplug others from the matrix. And that's like a radical act. And what's so surprising is the ways in which you could do that, which, sorry, Carla, but are like kind of outlined in the book that Carla co-authorized. It's about like friendships. It's about like sitting down and eating with one another. It's about like having conversations that are relational rather than like institutionalizing, or professionalizing activism or radical movements. We can't do that. Like we've seen what happens when we become too institutionalized, like the American Indian movement, the Black Panthers, whether underground, when they become a system that can be defined very clearly and there are edges to it, other structures try to dismantle it. So imagine if you created a structure that had no boundaries and no edges and was just relational and communal. Like that is so radical. Like that is like so much more beautiful to me as well. And so for myself, like I think about that and I'm like, well, that's the way I grew up. Like I didn't know that I was a part of a radical resistance movement. I was just a kid helping my mom make placards and, come up with chants for rallies. And that act of my mother choosing to raise us in a community, like, and I grew up like all the stuff that you talk about in your book, like that's how I grew up. Like I grew up with community. I grew up knowing that you could like like talk to your neighbors and like eat food with each other, and that we have to have community and that we can't be independent and like islands alone. And a lot of that is from Indigenous teachings, like particularly Northern communities. Community is everything, because literally you would die in the frigid cold if you thought you were like an individual that could just like hoard all the resources and live like alone. You would die. So the reality is that we need to have like the symbiotic relationship, not just with nature, but there has to be symbiosis within our own communities and how we relate to each other and how we share our resources. And that's super critical. And unfortunately in this world, that's also really radical.
Wow, that's beautiful. It reminds me of when I grew up in the early years on an army base in the military. And I haven't actually put it out in the world, but I wrote a piece that's the ways that growing up in a military base taught me about mutual aid and solidarity and about reciprocity versus extraction relationships. And it always shocks people, but there's like a soldier ethic was no one left behind, you don't leave anybody behind. And we don't need to go down the terrible road of militarism. We know how bad it is, but the community, like the families, that's how we lived. No one went without, everyone took care of everybody. And it's true. And that's one of the things we try to do in the book, was to show that this isn't something it's not on the horizon. We're already doing it. It's already been happening and particularly we talked about it being in BIPOC communities. So I love that. But like individualism and liberalism is shitty and powerful, and it seeps in. And I'm curious, like over the years, one of the things we're trying to do with this show is to just to show that we're always learning, and none of us arrived completely understanding, I got it all figured out. So we were asking people like yourself who are just wonderful and incredible organizers and show up really well. But like, there must have been times when you were learning or you had to have like a facepalm moment, and we're just asking you to maybe share some of those.
Oh, we are such fallible creatures. And I think like the reality is that we, systems of like hyper-individualism, liberalism, really grounded in systems of deeply entrenched white supremacy that exists in our country, have like, you need to be perfect, like hyper perfectionism, hyper individuality. It's so hard on people, because then they make mistakes and then they're like, oh my God, I should never be doing this. And particularly, I'm going to like talk about how like within like white allies, like moving into like BIPOC spaces, they make mistakes and then they get scolded by someone, and they're just like, oh my God, I've done everything for you and I make one mistake. It's just like, get over yourself. You're going to get scolded. You're going to get told what's what. It's what you do with that moment afterwards that matters. And let me tell you, I have been scolded more than a handful of times by the elders in my community or like within movement spaces. I have been put in my place, I don't know how many times, too many. And they're important. Those times of failure and making mistakes are critical to our growth. And we have to learn humility and how to let go of our ego in those moments, to just be like, okay, like I'm still committed to this work. I'm still committed to this thing. I still want to grow, and to not just like allow those moments of like failure to consume you. We all have to fail. Like, a bird isn't born learning, like knows how to fly. He has to fall a couple times down a tree to like figure out how his wings work. And it's the same thing in these movement spaces. We are all, just fumbling. We are not perfect at all. I have so many mistakes in my life. I don't even know where to start. I think I'll tell a story where I feel like it worked out in the end, but it was definitely very difficult. With my nation, we brought Neil Young on a tour, or we did a tour with Neil Young where he raised funds for our nation to support our legal battle against Shell Oil. And a lot of folks wanted to just like meet Neil Young. And I had to make really hard choices as to who those people were, because Neil Young's team had no idea who anyone in the community was. And so they were just like, you're literally our liaison for every community we're in, and who we get to choose to, who gets the 20 free tickets and who gets the like 25 minutes of time that I have to meet folks. And I set up a time in Winnipeg with the Grand Chief of the council at the time, which was Derek Niebenak, and Chief Niebenak, and he wanted to meet him, and I said, sure, I could set that up. And he's like, I want to have a pipe ceremony with him, and I was like, I don't think that's going to be possible. Like, I'm literally squeezing you in between like 2 other interviews to sit down with him. And it turned into a very long conversation where I was told that I needed to adhere to community protocols, and this was a community protocol. And I couldn't, like, I physically couldn't like make Neil Young's schedule do that. And I was really like put into a situation where I had to be like, no, Derek Niebenak, no to your community protocols. It's not going to happen. And if you try to make it happen, you will be removed from the premises. It's a really hard place to be in to say something like that. And, you know, Derek and I had some tense moments. And we kind of like had to work it out, where I said, okay, how about this? You can have some sort of protocol with him, but it needs to be within the confines. He was only supposed to get 10 minutes. And I'm like, I'm stretching it to 30. These are where I can make things work. But it's really hard within these spaces when we're constantly, even still to this day, told like, you need to choose between like the systems of capitalism to fundraise for your nation, and up here like this white, you know, idyllic folk singer, or a community member. And I'm just like, what? Still? And it's hard. Like we have to make mistakes, and we have to have those hard conversations, and we have to be willing to put ourselves into those hard conversations in order to learn. And from that, like Derek and I's relationship actually strengthened, and we chatted a lot, and he's been a great person to talk to about like even the organization that I've built. But we have to be willing to make the mistakes, and be willing to sit down and have a discussion about what the repercussions of those mistakes are, how to remedy them or not remedy them, and how we move forward. And that's one thing that I've always learned, is like when your elder yells at you and you sit in the corner and you cry afterwards, like, okay, and then you go back to them and you say thank you. Like, we have to be able to do that, to have that humility and let go of our egos.
That's a hell of a story, first of all, and secondly, that's some really powerful insight there. And one of the things that I thought of when you were when you were talking about the white allies as well, is that something that I've seen happen is that folks will get called in, or scolded, or however you want to put it, and then they'll get really afraid to come back to the space, because they're like, I'm so afraid that I'm going to fuck up or do something wrong that I'm just leaving altogether. And I'm like, well, that's not helpful at all. So like kind of in line with that, like, I'm curious, this issue of fear and being afraid, not just of fucking up, but also just like fear of what we're up against. And I'm curious to hear more about like what scared you or made you feel unsure or afraid when you first not when you first started, but like along your journey, and how are those feelings still present, and how do you like unpack those feelings?
I mean, fear is an important emotion. It's part of like why humans exist. So like, let's not knock on fear. We need it. And it's okay. And it's good to be afraid. I once had someone say that to me. They're like, you should be afraid. Particularly on my journey to start my own organization. I was just like, I don't know what I'm doing. I'm so afraid. And they're like, you should be afraid. And if you're not afraid, then there's something wrong with you. Because if you think you have all the answers and you think you know everything, then you probably know nothing. An elder once also told me that. Like the same elder said, I know nothing. And this is like someone that I was going to for wisdom. They're like, I'm just a small creature on this, on this planet, and I know nothing. And anyone who thinks they know everything is one of the most dangerous people. So it's important to have fear. And I think, I would say that starting in this journey, it's not like I was just like, this is what I'm going to do. This is my life work. Now I feel like I can say that. But at the beginning, I remember in my early 20s, like having this moment where I was very unsure of what path I wanted to take. At the time, I was working for the Federation of Saskatchewan Indian Nations. I was a researcher, an archival and historical researcher for treaty land entitlement and specific land claims, which that whole system is so like flawed because you're like writing claims for the government of Canada to be the judge, jury, and executor, like to determine, like if I write a claim of a nation that says you breached treaty, and I would outline all the ways they did, the Canada would be like, maybe. Okay, we did a little bit here, so we'll compensate you here. It was a really weird, like I was very empowered and I learned so much in that job. And I was being asked to step into a director role in that organization, this institution that was funded wholly by the government, and was a part of this system that really wasn't working. And I was frustrated by it. I was frustrated by this like backlog of over like 1,500 land claims. And I was just writing more to add to the system. And I was just like, is this really what I want to do? Like sit in the archives for the rest of my life and like interview community members. I want to and I was privy to so much amazing historical information that is not taught in our schools. That is not like, our own communities don't even know our history because they've been like literally buried and erased from for human, like for our consumption, our society. Like they've literally taken it out of our school books. Like we don't learn about these things. And I remember like the book Clearing the Plains by James Jaschuk is such a good book. And like that's the kind of stuff that I was reading for like 7 years and just being like, what? And I was so disenchanted by the structures that I was participating in. And I was so angry that our own communities did not have access to this information. But I had no idea how I was going to change that. I had no idea what I would even do to begin to change that. And I had like this existential crisis at like 23 years old. I was just like, I don't know what I'm doing. And I remember like having like this breakdown and just be like, I don't want to contribute to this corrupt system anymore. Our people need to know this. And my friend, a good friend of mine, named Sarah Tikal, she just said to me, what do you love? And I was like, I love my people and my community. And she's like, what do you want to do? And I'm like, I want them to know this information. And she's like, then figure out how to do that and just worry about that. And she's like, you just got to figure out, distill it down to one thing. Don't try to like topple the Canadian government. Just find something like focus, like refocus yourself. And I remember sitting with that for a while and just being like, what can I do? And I switched to doing like youth engagement work and working with Native communities. I started doing the UN work. And I really started just like thinking like, I can't like teach all of our communities, but I can like talk to other young people and we can start talking about like these systems, and I can start trying to share the information that I have and learn. Because like, that's the big thing. It's like, I didn't go in with all the information. I like saw the tip of the iceberg and I was like, oh my God, this is so scary. And I know nothing. And just being like, what else is out there? And within the UN Indigenous Youth Caucus stuff, I learned even more. And I learned just how much this wasn't just an ailment of this colonial country of Canada, but this structure of colonialism and capitalism and white supremacy was rampant across the globe. And that our struggle wasn't just this struggle alone in, when I was living in Saskatchewan, but it was like a struggle of the world. And that opened my eyes to something so much bigger and so much more. And that's when I started connecting, like shortly in like my 20s also, I met folks. I read about IEN, Indigenous Environmental Network, and I traveled down to Mexico to a Zapatista gathering and like met like Marcos. And like, I just was like, I want to consume all the information. And it was really a learning journey, I would say, for about 5 or 6 years of just like talking to people and learning and trying to understand like what tactics and strategies and ways in which people have been trying to address this historically. I didn't come in like, oh, I know the answers. I really, really learned for a long time. I spent a lot, I would say about 10 years. 10 years, I just learned, like I'm talking from like the archival research stuff when I worked at FSIN to like when I started doing like the work. It was 10 years of learning and like listening and just I didn't talk at meetings. Like there were so many times I was just sitting there, and I have so many notebooks. I was talking about how my notebook collection, I don't know what I'm going to do with it because I have like stacks of notebooks where I just wrote and I wrote and I wrote and I listened and I wrote down things and I circled them, put stars around them. And it's really important that within this work that we have both humility in knowing how to fail, but humility in knowing that and understanding that we don't have all the answers, and that if you come into this work, you have to be willing to sit and listen and take the time to understand what's already been done before you start stepping into that arena. We have too many people that come into this work where they're just like, oh, I see a problem, I know the solution to it because like I like have a master's in, you know, geopolitics. And it's just like, no, dude, you don't have the answers just because you got a master's in geopolitics. Like I sat in archival research for 6.5 years, and my mentor at the organization told me I should have a PhD in this work. And I was like, I don't even want to do that. Like I totally like left the academic institution. I said I never wanted a degree because I didn't want to be commodified. I was studying political economy, and I was like, I don't want to just be valued based on whether or not I have a certificate of this or that or another. Like in order to like literally uncouple ourselves from those systems and challenge them was to also like enter into the system without the credentials that were required and still know how to speak their language and still know all the things that, you know, someone with a PhD knows, and still be able to challenge them and stand up and say, I don't need your education systems, I don't need your stuff, but what you do need is humility and the ability to sit back and listen before you step in.
Hear, hear. I love it. Oh my gosh, you're speaking from my heart. And super jealous that you met Marcos, just gonna say. The poet, the beautiful, beautiful. Sorry, I digress. I think I was just thinking about, like, you were talking about your path, finding your path, and it sounded like you planted a lot of seeds, not just for yourself, but for so many others, and probably it's been really exciting to see them germinate. And I'm curious about like what you're most excited about now, and looking into the future and your journey, and is there stuff you feel like you still need to learn? That's maybe like a learning curve for you at this point in your organizing, and particularly thinking about intersections. Like I liked in your bio, you talked about like your work is intersecting Indigenous land stuff with other social issues. So maybe connecting those dots. I
feel like I know nothing most of the time. And I don't say that just like some sort of like, oh, I know nothing. Like there are times where like I go into spaces and will be the first to admit, like, this is all new to me. I really like, I'm here to like listen and learn. Some of the stuff that I've really been exploring for the last couple of years is like Indigenous feminisms, and like looking at the different feminisms and intersections of feminisms, and like feminisms with the S on the end. It's very like, because there's not just like feminism, there's lots of intersections within that sector as well. And like within that, it has opened up so many doors to just like unpacking like some really interesting stuff. Like it's because within in the aspect and the sort of thought within Indigenous feminisms, it's like unpacking not just the patriarchy, but like colonialism. Particularly Indigenous women have faced a lot of like sex trafficking and a history of like being like hypersexualized. A lot of POs, like BIPOC folks have, like, let's be real. But like really trying to like unpack these things as part of this whole sector. So it gets like missing and murdered Indigenous women, but then talking about how like our responsibilities as Indigenous women in relation to land and our responsibilities in our community, and how that intersects with climate justice, and how that intersects with like anti-capitalist like movements, and it intersects with like all these different spaces. And you start to realize that, oh, wait a second, like all of our work is actually intersecting. And then it becomes really critical and important to understand these things. So some of the stuff that I've really been like digging deep in is like trying to understand like other BIPOC histories much more deeper and more nuanced, so that, to be totally frank, like in Canada, we Indigenous folks have a lot of voice, and voice doesn't necessarily equate power. Like I just want to name that first, because like we have voice, we have a lot of voice, we have visibility, and that's great. It's really, really great. In the United States, if we're talking about BIPOC populations, the Black, like African American community has a lot of voice. What I've seen, and this might be controversial to anyone who's listening, but what I've seen and what I'm trying to like really looking at and unpacking is how when we are empowered to have voice and to challenge these systems in a very public facing space, how are we ensuring that we are not also appropriating or like disrespecting other BIPOC and marginalized communities within those spaces? Like, how do we address like anti-Blackness in Indigenous communities? How do we address anti-indigeneity within the Black community? How do we address like the xenophobias within both of our communities? And these are two very powerful voices on the sides of the medicine line or the colonial borders that exist in North America, that have the ability to start really, I don't want to say attacking, but like addressing and undoing systems of white supremacy and colonialism. And yet we don't even talk to each other in a way that's like super powerful or strategic. And I think that we can take this all the way back to the American Indian movement and the Black Panthers, because they were starting to do that. And it was strategically uncoupled because of the powers that lied. And we can take it back even further than that. And we can talk about like during like the slavery movements, slaves were uprising with Native folks back then, but also Native folks were slave trading. There's like so many like corrupt histories, but histories do not define where we're going in the future. Histories are lessons for us to learn so that we can learn how to grow. Just like culture, like Indigenous cultures and our teachings are not static. They are not like set in stone. We are not like reading from scripture, from a Bible. Like these are things that were always organic, and they always changed with seasons and lands and whoever told those stories. And like we have to treat our movements in the same way. Yes, there's been lots of harm that's been done in all sorts of different ways, but where are we going from that? How are we learning those lessons, and how are we moving forward? And like for me, that's a big thing. Like, okay, so if I want to really be intersectional, then it is my responsibility to do that learning. It is my responsibility to understand the history of like Indigenous Black relations in North America. It's my responsibility to understand like, Japanese and Chinese like internment camps of basically indentured workers, and like understand like where our histories and movements intersect. Like, what does land back mean when we're talking about like people that are refugees from other countries? How do we tie these intersections together that isn't just going to be replicating systems of harm or oppression? And most recently, one of my craziest journeys is that I've started taking yoga teacher training. And it is just like chock full of appropriation and just like, oh God, it's been such a struggle. But also like thinking about like, it's also a beautiful practice, and there are some beautiful teachings in there. And so how do I like honor and respect the traditional roots of yoga and not participate in the appropriation and the further marginalization of like Indians and Desi women within like yoga? Like that's my responsibility. So I think it's like one thing, like you could be radical, you could attach yourself to a movement and be radical about it, but like, are you really being radical if you are not like doing your due diligence to look at the intersections of where your movement affects other folks, and how are you ensuring you're not replicating those systems of harm? And lastly, like the last part of my journey, which again stemmed from my start into like this Indigenous feminisms things, is like, how do we, like, sorry, Carla, how do we find joy in our movements? Like joy is so important, and it is we've lost it because we become so like stuck on like fighting the structures and bringing them down that we end up hurting people along the way. And how do we build those relationships? How do we like find not just relationships with other people, but how do we like recenter our relationships with each other? In the last 20 years that I've been doing this work, I burned myself out hardcore. And I'm like wrapping up a sabbatical where I've taken time off of work that has been critical. And one of the things that I've learned is that I have become so detached from myself, which has led to this like further detachment from others. And that reconnecting with and when I say myself, I mean like my physical body, the trauma, the PTSD of like that we experience on the daily requires us to be resilient and to build up these walls and this armor to be able to take down these structures that are oppressing us and causing these harm. But through that, we lose touch with ourselves and we lose that softness. And we often end up having to rely on ego to help us move through these like really hard spaces. But when we through the practice of yoga, connecting through breath and body, like that simple practice. And then I think about how those practices existed in so many of our cultures, but that have been replaced through like forced assimilation tactics of like hyper-individualism, productivity, perfections, like all of these things that like are centered around these systems of white supremacy and colonization, and how we really need to be like finding ways to ensure that we are centered in ourselves and that we find ways to connect with others on those same levels, because that's going to be the stuff that like that's the most powerful stuff for me, in my opinion. Like when we are happy and when our parasympathetic and our sympathetic nervous system are regulated, so that when we enter those spaces, we're not going like this and then like having an adrenal crash afterwards and being like, oh my God, I just need to take like a week off. Like you shouldn't need to take a week off after you've gone into a meeting with some executives. We should be having supports in our community where we regulate our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems, where we have moments of joy and that we know that those moments exist and that we have permission to take them. Because I think a lot of times we think we don't have permission to do that because we live in such a fucked up world that we think we just have to constantly be on, but we don't. Drink that cup of tea, sit down, relax, like take a bath. And it sounds simple, but you start there. And then you start to like talk about joy. And I'm thinking of starting a little podcast. It's just in the works. I've got a couple of people lined up, and it's going to be called "We Can't Be Stoic All the Time." And it's going to be about movements, but like with levity, with the stories of humor, with the stories of self-care and why those things are so critical, and like poking fun with my friends. And I think like that stuff is so beautiful and so critical and necessary.
You're listening to Silver Threads, part of the Grounded Futures multimedia platform. For more information and to donate to our totally ad-free show, check out groundedfutures.com. You can reach out to us with thoughts and suggestions at silverthreadshow@protonmail.com. You can find out more about our host Eleanor via artkillingapathy.com and our host Carla via joyfulthreadsproductions.com.
What's up, y'all? I'm Pearson, host of Coffee with Comrades. Coffee with Comrades is rooted in militant joy. Our hope is to cultivate a warm and inviting atmosphere, like walking into your favorite coffee shop to sit down with some of your close friends and share a heart-to-heart conversation. New episodes premiere every Tuesday, so be sure to smash that subscribe button wherever you get your podcast so that you never miss an episode. We are proud to be a part of the Channel Zero Network.